Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another episode of this oral history podcast series, a journey through the past, present, and future of mining. I'm your host, Priscilla Nelson, and joining me is my co-host, Mónica Ospina. Today, we're continuing our deep dive into the evolving world of mining and sustainability with our esteemed guests, Glenn Sigurdson and Luke Danielson. In this episode, we'll be discussing the global standards that have shaped the mining industry since the early 2000s, and which are crucial for responsible resource extraction. We'll trace the roots of these standards, look at the emergence of terms like social license, and examine the challenges of making these frameworks enforceable and meaningful.
Glenn and Luke bring invaluable insights into the complexity of creating and enforcing global standards in mining. From the rise of industry-led initiatives to the influence of NGOs and financial institutions, today's conversation explores how these standards have evolved and where we are heading. If you ever wonder how companies balance profit, reputation, and ethical responsibility, this episode is for you.
Luke, as we continue our discussion, I think we were reviewing MMSD and what the implications of it were and what some of the go-forward consequences of it have been. But maybe I'm going to throw it back to you and give us an insight into the world that you saw as it was unfolding immediately before and then beyond the conclusion of the MMSD project in, 2001?
One of the expectations of that project on the part of many of its sponsors and others was that it would come out with a set of global standards that would apply to the mining industry. And I suppose in the most simplistic way, some mining people were saying, just tell us what the rules are. What do we need to do to get everybody off our back? It was unrealistic in a global project that short to think we would come up with some kind of, list of 15 ideas that if you complied with these, everything would be great and no one would ever criticize you again. Right? But we did, I think, set the groundwork for a lot of that, and we contributed to the development of a long series of standards. Ultimately, I think something like IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, and all of the sectoral standards like Copper Mark and the aluminum sustainability standard and the gold standard, all of these to some extent have their roots in that, but the idea was to move toward some kind of set of rules for what it is people should have to do. And I think we did not achieve that. I think we pretty quickly announced that we didn't think we could do that because really the viability of those standards and their effectiveness, Glenn taught me this years ago, but the value in those standards is directly proportional to the quality of the consultative process that led to them, right? You can't have a really valuable, useful set of standards unless it's a product of really broad consultation and trying to consult the whole world. Glenn and I went on that ride during MMSD, and trying to consult the entire world is a pretty difficult challenge, right?
So let's just go back a step as to what the state of the standards was as you saw them before MMSD. We really were in a vacuum to a great extent, but some significant things that happened, including the IFC performance standards as an example.
Right. The IFC performance standards, first, they really were important and they were a big step forward. I was amazed that I had the opportunity to participate in that, but I did. They were not sectoral, right? They didn't focus on mining. They basically focused on every kind of project that the World Bank might finance. So, and indeed they came out of our experience with a hydroelectric project in Chile But then as MMSD cranked up, we had a bunch of things. It was an incredible ferment, and a lot of it was in London, in part because London has been the center of several of the world's biggest mining companies. And at the time, Tony Blair was prime minister, and he was a big supporter of this kind of thing. So we wound up with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative bubbling up. Many of the same people that were in the MMSD project were involved in that. The voluntary principles on security and human rights that talk about how companies, security forces should interact with local communities came up at that time. The International Code for the Management of Cyanide came up, and at any rate, all of those were being created at the same time as the MMSD project, and in each case involved a lot of the same people that were involved with MMSD. And since then, with Professor Ruggi's work on business and human rights, with the expansion, the Global Reporting Initiative, that was another one that was going on at about the same time. But with the expansion of all these, the question in these standard systems, and I'd love to know, Glenn, what you think of this, but you can sit there, as some people have done, and write a rule book for the world. Here's what everyone should do. But one of the questions is, well, who manages the standard system, and who does the accountability piece of deciding whether a particular company in a particular place has complied with the standards or not? And that's, I think, one of the key issues, right? How do you see that issue, Glenn? The question of, I guess a lawyer might call it enforceability, but how do you go about, once you've got a document that says this is what people are supposed to be doing, with having some kind of system to decide whether they are or aren't complying?
Yeah, no, it's obviously a fundamental question. I guess that one of the things that one might distinguish is between kind of some legal mechanism, which is a complex and cumbersome and difficult thing to create, much less to monitor and enforce, and it costs a lot of money. So who would do it, and who's going to pay for it, and how it's going to be administered, all those things. So it really comes down to a more pragmatic question of what kind of oversight and accountability and transparency is going to be connected with it to provide some degree of accountability. I think that's a more pragmatic thing. But we have experimented with different other options. So in Canada, there was increasing pressure on Canadian mining companies, and indirectly through that, because our global reputation as a country is always connected to the mining world, just like it is in respect to many of our other industrial activities globally. We created this corporate social responsibility policy of the government of Canada. I think that was around 2006 or something like that, something in that neighborhood. I always find that curious, because it wasn't the policy of the government of Canada, it was the corporate responsibility policy. So they were in effect talking about how to enforce corporate behavior because of the pressure coming, and they created the office of the CSR counselor. The CSR counselor was presumably empowered to have oversight over the activities of Canadian companies, and we ran in that process, which is worth exploring a bit more perhaps, but we ran headlong into questions about how detailed those investigations could be, because you run into questions of international jurisdiction and what right does some Canadian CSR counselor, ostensibly like an ombudsman, have to start reviewing and considering and enforcing activity in, say, Mexico. So the whole area becomes extremely cumbersome. So that's part of an answer, I guess, Luke.
The interesting thing is not all of the impetus for creating these standards comes from industry, but a lot of it has come from industry. And there are, two or three threads there that one of them is our company is doing a really good job. And we look over on the other side of the mountain, there's another company that's doing really a crappy job. And we're incurring costs that they don't have to incur. And we wish they had to incur these same costs, and we're incurring reputational damage because the stuff these people are doing is tarring the entire mining industry. And so we would like to have some standards that these other people would have to follow. That was, there are a number of other related issues. One of them is bank related. These big projects tend to be financed by consortia of banks. It's very rare for a single bank to take on all of the risk of let's say, a giant new mining project. So there might be 4, 5, 6 banks. And once banks got the idea that they had to be policing this stuff, that they couldn't just throw money out there and hope for the best. That, my friend Randy Hayes rappelled down the side of the Citibank building with a big banner. Once the banks started realizing that their reputations were at risk, then there's the problem that we have 5 banks financing this project. And if every one of them has its own set of rules and its own due diligence process, it's incredibly cumbersome. So that was the fundamental reason the banks bought into the Equator Principles, is it was driving them crazy to try to do the due diligence on these projects if every bank had its own due diligence process. I will say this, I'm a former mine regulator here in the state of Colorado, and at one time we did a survey, and 80% of the complaints we received about the behavior of mining companies were submitted by employees of mining companies who they know what's supposed to be done. They know what's good practice. They know what's bad practice. And when they see somebody else doing something bad, they're very well informed. But so, in that sense, there's an industry pressure, there's a financial community pressure, and probably some other pressures that push us in the direction of these standards.
What year did the Equator Principles were they adopted? And a follow-up, what year was the World Bank, or when did they create the Office of the Ombudsman?
That was 1998.
1998. And is that when the Equator Principles were on the same time?
The Equator Principles were a couple of years later. I would have to look it up, but it might have been 2000 or 2001.
Right.
But,
so to go back to the point you were making about earlier, there was a whole bunch of stuff that was starting to bubble up immediately before MMSD that was putting heightened visibility on the mining industry and a greater sensitivity. So when they came together at Davos, there was that kind of a background starting to lurch around the whole question, and there was increasing issues, as I recall it, around north-south issues. There was a North-South Institute, and it was having some kind of forums that it was raising these issues at as well. So when you paint the picture, MMSD seemed to burst onto the scene, but in a way, a lot of stuff in the 90s was kind of gurgling up, starting with something as basic as that Whitehorse Initiative, which brought together for the first time a lot of companies and NGOs and players in Canada in the early 90s. So these things were, And then Jim Cooney threw out a term that I don't think he ever anticipated would take on the potency that it has. He gave a talk at the World Bank in 1997 on social license, just a term that he invented to pick up these different threads that were lurching around as he went in. And I'd say that that term gradually filtered in. It didn't take off quickly, but over the next 5 or 6 years, it kept growing and growing. So that became kind of a talisman in a way for a lot of conversations about social license, and created a focal point in my view. I don't know how you see that, but that was kind of what I was watching unfold.
I think what we have seen is that, well, you referred to it earlier, groups that were not empowered in the past became empowered. And I'd say, the classic example is that in the days I started getting involved in this, in most of the developing world, you had to get the government on board, you had to get the company on board. And if the government and the company agreed, that was great. What happened over the years is we started realizing that when a lot of the former colonies became independent, the government wound up run by an elite that didn't necessarily represent everybody. Part of that was necessary because, the colonialists had made sure that, the benefits of education didn't spread very far in those societies. And so there weren't very many skilled, educated people. But in any case, what you wound up with was a deal where the national government and the company made a deal. And then what we started finding out was, in this country, there are 6 major tribal groups. And, the biggest tribal group and the second biggest tribal group have taken over the government, and basically all the leadership comes from there. But this mine is in a territory of some other tribal group that the government has no particular love for and doesn't want to help. And so you wind up with the community getting empowered. So instead of a two-way deal, it's now a three-way deal. You have to get the local interest involved. And, I remember sitting with a mines minister of an Asian country who told me, when I talked, I said, what benefits are going to go to the communities impacted by mining? And he said, hopefully as few as possible, because they have the benefit of having the mine there. So they have all the employment and the roads and all of the money that the government gets from this project, to the extent that it's available for local development, should go to some other part of the country and not to the mining impacted regions, right? So you had that kind of attitude, and in some cases, the companies were really caught right in the middle of major internal political fights in countries between local interests and the national government.
We were seeing the emergence of some powerful environmental advocacy organizations over that period, including Mining Watch here in Canada. Steve Esposito was with his Mineral Policy Center, I think that was the exact word, but which would later become Earthworks. But there was a proliferation across the globe of NGOs that were working to crystallize some of the concerns, not just as they saw them through environmental lenses, but through the lens of the communities in which they were located. I think the Philippines has more NGOs per population than any other place in the world. So we're looking at an NGO movement that had become quite global. I remember being on one call when I was working in the middle of some of these issues that were at the edge of the MMSD between companies and environmental groups. And there was, I think, 40 environmental groups on one call. that was being organized through the Mineral Policy Center, and they were getting significant funding out of foundations. I can't remember if it was the Rockefeller or Ford Foundation, and it would culminate in many major advocacy campaigns, including Dirty Gold, which was a major campaign around 2000, as I recall, in which Newmont was very much centered up at that particular time. But that's another whole reality that was going on, and they would, into the 2000s, as I saw it, start to really hone in on this term social license and start giving it momentum in the years following. I don't know, you were pretty close to a lot of people in the environmental movement yourself, so was that kind of what you were witnessing?
Yeah, and these issues were not all that easy or all of that attractive the way they worked out, right? There's a lot of difficulty in trying to figure out how all these pieces came together. There was just one example. There's a lot of resentment in the developing world over NGOs based in the US, Canada, or Europe showing up, claiming to represent local interests, and being pretty aggressive and bossy about what they demanded that the government do, right? And so, if you're the government of a poor developing country and some guy, I remember I was sitting with some government people at a meeting, and they said, I am a prime minister, a vice prime minister, and I was elected by 4 million votes. And I am now expected to sit on a basis of equality with a representative of some organization that, as best I can tell, is two young men with a website somewhere in Europe. Where is the respect for the sovereignty of our country and our political process? And I also sat with a bunch of my NGO colleagues, which is, my root is in the NGO movement. And I remember when I said, why don't you, feel a need to be, instead of going to the World Bank and trying to cut off their funding, why don't you talk to the developing country governments? And the answer was, all they see in these projects is a chance to get rich. All of the officials are corrupt. They're all on the take. And the farther we stay away from talking to them, the better off we are. So there's it's a little bit a reprise of the environment versus development debates that occurred in the Brundtland Commission, right?
Right.
Are we in favor of development? Are we against development? So, they're really trying to bring all these people together. And, yes, there are a lot of great NGOs in the developing world, but really a lot of them are funded by foundations in New York or somewhere. And, as a result, local political leadership, doesn't necessarily always think that they're legitimate representatives of a broad cross section of the country. They're the mouthpiece of the Ford Foundation.
And I think the same kind of thing was starting to grow in perhaps a little slower in Canada. You talked about the growth out of the colonial empires of the last century, and this one, or of the last century, I mean, in the century before, there was a lot of continuity in the legal regimes around those in the British Commonwealth, and Canada has very much been a leader, I think, in some of the issues around that. From a legal point of view, major legal cases started to develop in Canada in the early 80s. There was a major decision called Sparrow out of the Supreme Court of Canada, then another one in 1992 called Delgamuukw, which really started to build on and put legal teeth under the concept of Aboriginal title. Aboriginal rights and title. And these kind of forces were starting to spread, including in the Australian courts to some degree, although Canada, I think, in Rhodesia. And so there was some kind of cross-pollination going on. What was going on in Canada was a gradual, I guess, awakening of the political and legal power. There had been growing political power in Canada for many decades around Indigenous rights, but particularly from the 60s onward. And now we were starting to see legal teeth being drilled into this whole framework over those 2 decades. And prior to, as the legal teeth became more direct and there was a greater sense of independence from the environmental movement, there was tensions growing between the environmental movement and the indigenous communities, because in many ways the environmental groups were looking for authenticity by allying themselves with these indigenous communities and indigenous rights and interests. As time went on into the next decades, there was increasing sense of detachment. We're not going to be spoken to or used in some way by environmental groups. But on the whole, I think the relationship has been reasonably healthy, but there's no doubt been a change in the power relationships between the environmental movement, as I perceived it in this country, and indigenous rights and interests.
I would just say this. I can't help but saying I thought we were all headed in a better direction, and that more and more on every side, people were understanding this. Environmental groups were starting to speak respectfully about leadership of developing countries. Everybody was giving indigenous communities the space to say what was on their minds. And in that sense, I think that a terrible step backward was this tailing standard process, right? Basically a bunch of people from Canada and the US and Australia were put on a board to write the standard. The consultation with the developing countries that are deeply impacted by this was really, really sketchy. Just the optics of having an advisory board that doesn't have a single Brazilian or a single Chilean, or I think is terrible, and it created a lot of resentment, and I think rightfully so.
And when was that period that you're referring to now, Luke, approximately?
2 years ago.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, that's a very recent thing. But in terms of the continuity that we were dealing with here, so we're dealing with a kind of a fundamental proliferation of these norms and standards. I think one of the first big ones that really started to gain momentum was this global compact that the UN was running around with.
Sure.
And I think that was around 2000. I think I met that guy, Kels, what is this? I forget his last name, but he was working with Kofi Annan at the time, and they were trying to jump in. So the UN was starting to jump around all these issues as well in a more robust way, let's put it that way. They had been involved through the World Bank and other things, but now suddenly we're getting them into the game. But now, as we look at it, I guess the question I asked, and I think we talked about it earlier, Luke, in one of our conversations, maybe on the side, is what was driving all of these demands for these standards? Have we gone through that enough? We've touched on it in a pretty detailed way, but are we able to get at it? Like, how did the indigenous communities see it? How did the environmentalist communities? What roles did the governments play? What roles did the mining companies?
Yeah.
Was there something in it for all of them?
This is a huge subject, and I wish somebody would write a book about it. Daniel Franks wrote a book that touches on this stuff. I think we talked a little bit about the mining companies.
Yeah.
Beyond the mining companies, I think the financial community, the people who finance these things, are important. I think the other issue, and it's one still playing out. The non-governmental organizations, the environmentalists, the human rights organizations, all of those people, on one hand, they see a real potential to get their agenda recognized and to do something constructive. On the other hand, they're very distressed by the IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, was committed from the outset to multi-stakeholder governance. So they've got NGOs and governments and experts and companies on their board. And what's happened is this upsurge of certification systems with no balanced governance. And so on one hand, we have the industry-led standards, like Copper Mark is one of them. And I think, I did think good things about Copper Mark, but if you're an NGO and you have the IRMA standard that's run by a multi-stakeholder group, and you have the Copper Mark standard, which is run by an industry association, they're going to be very, very suspicious of the Copper Mark standard. And when they see companies stampeding in that direction, it's going to be, they're going to be very suspicious that there's something, there's something going on behind the scenes. And particularly there are some of these standard systems, I've been involved in advising at least one of them, where the company that's assessed pays for the assessment, right? And so what I've seen is the company that's paying for the assessment uses that as a way of pushing back. The assessor says, I think we need to review the issue of water quality in the river, and we want enough of a budget to include or to allow us to do that. And the company is saying, that's not an issue, it's not important, and we're not going to front the money to do that. So that's where that's all playing out right now. The exciting thing, I think, is convergence. I think that these industry association standards, like aluminum and copper and gold and zinc, are converging with IRMA. And I'm going to make a bold prediction that, 5 years from now, within the next 5 years, there's going to be some kind of understanding where some kind of a common system is developed. And in many cases, it's going to be driven by another player we haven't mentioned, which is the consumers, right? That is, let's say, Ford or Tesla or people like that. There's, the Global Battery Alliance, which is all the people who consume lithium for these big, electric car projects and things. Those companies are starting to push as well. And I think what we're finding is that they're happy that people are certified by anything. It's better than no certification, but they're not happy, or they're happier with multi-stakeholder management of the certification process than they are at industry-only systems. So look, one of the other issues is that the initial really big and impactful standards, the IFC performance standards, came out of the World Bank Group. The World Bank was one of the institutions created after World War II to hopefully rebuild the world after the war. And its voting on its board of directors was weighted based on how much countries contributed to the initial capital of the bank. And so the U.S., by far, look, Britain, France, Germany were destroyed by the war. And so the U.S. was the overwhelming contributor and had the overwhelming bunch of votes on the board. And over time, the Europeans contributed something, but basically countries like Brazil, Russia, India, and China contributed almost nothing to the capitalization of the bank, and as a result had almost no say in how the bank ran. And as time went on, and instead of just becoming developing countries seeking aid, these countries became sources of capital that moved abroad. There are Russian aluminum companies in Guinea. There are Chinese companies in Indonesia. There are Brazilian companies operating all over the world. So they became, investors abroad, and they chafed a good deal under the idea that they had to comply with these rules that they had no participation in forming. So that and other things led to the Chinese, Russians, Indians, and Brazilians funding their own kind of parallel structure to the World Bank. And when they first did that, there was a lot of talk among the recalcitrant in the World Bank group that, this just proves we never should have adopted these standards, because now we're going to lose all of our business. No one's going to come to us for loans because they're all going to go to these people who have no standards. What the interesting thing is to see that these parallel banking institutions have developed their own standards, and over time they're looking more and more like the IFC performance standards. So, there's that also is, a lot of these standards came into being at a time when the Europeans and the North Americans, with a little help from Japan and Australia, really ran the world economy and therefore could decide what the rules were going to be. That is no longer the case. And we need to cope with the fact that we've got a much more diverse global economy, and a lot of that is in the mining sector.
When we look at this, and then in addition, there's been all kinds of regional development banks as well that have come to play a more prominent role, I think, in the whole banking infrastructure around the globe. Just to go back a step, though, I think the fundamental point that you made some time ago, and really goes to the heart of what we were talking about in the context of Irma, engagement, authenticity. Without the proper participation of a variety of different players with different interests and stakes, different values, there's an inherent concern that whatever the standard is doesn't have legitimacy, doesn't speak for me in some way. It hasn't taken into account my interest in the overall framework. And I think that takes us to the heart of what the biggest issue in many ways is. It's about how we build these effective engagement structures, these relationships, because the fundamental underlying reason for them is authenticity and credibility. They speak much more powerfully if they speak with a multiplicity of voices. And how we create those kinds of forums that allow for that kind of legitimacy is often something that is totally bypassed in the question of standard creation. Increasingly, though, there has been those that have been pushing on the sidelines to say, well, they're not my standards and I don't respect them. And that's what gave rise to Irma. I facilitated all of the initial conversations from 2006 here in Vancouver, where it started. With about 40 different players that included everybody from Walmart to environmental groups to mining companies. De Beers was there. I can't remember all of the players, but there was about 40 of us struggling with this fundamental question, because the notion was, I guess to put it in my mantra, it's good to be good, but not good enough. Unless you're seen to be good, by those who see the world differently than you haven't created value. And so the reason that people like Dave Baker at Newmont were in the room was because he understood the fundamental value proposition that was there. The same with the people at BHP. I can remember the conversations in Washington. They were there because they saw it as a value creating possibility, as it would speak more loudly and forcefully to the big world out there. And I can remember a very powerful anecdote from this dynamic lady from Walmart. She was quite a lady, and she was in the initial room with Irma, and she looked around these folks, these guys that were there, and she said, "You know, you guys have your mining property. I got my mining property too. It's called 20 square feet of retail space. And I'm worried about what goes on my mining property. And you better damn well be worried about what goes on my property as well." And that kind of captured a powerful, sense of what the driver was. And there it was. And she was there because of that. And then you saw the jewelry community starting to get very active for a period there, and still are, and were a driving force behind Irma, because they were also getting customers coming to the jewelry store. And a young man looking for a diamond didn't like to think that there might be blood diamonds connected with what he was giving his future bride. And these were very real concerns coming out of the consumer community at the time. So this whole area of engagement, authenticity, is a value driver. And once you start understanding that it's a value driver, then you can start building the motivation for people to be part of it.
I had breakfast at Tiffany's with Tiffany's CEO,
right,
who was telling me that, Tiffany Foundation wound up being one of the initial and biggest funders of a lot of these activities. Right. And he explained to me what it was like having all of these rich socialites from New York coming in and saying, I want you to tell me for sure that this diamond bracelet isn't coming from these places where they're cutting the arms off little kids. Right. And consumer pressure is really good. And I think one of the problems in the minerals sector is that the product is it's very hard to penetrate the whole chain from some miner in Congo to my Tesla, right? And, I'm sitting here looking at a variety of metal objects in front of me on my desk. I'm not even sure what metal most of them are made out of. They may be made out of alloys. Who knows where they came from? It's really the consumer is able to put on pressure, but only if there's transparency in that chain. There are forces out there in the world that are trying to muddy the waters on this, right? The British do all the mining, but then the copper concentrate winds up going to continental Europe, or to Germany, to Holland, to Belgium, to France. I had the head of one of these one of the senior executives of one of the European metal refiner organizations tell me, we spent almost $100 million in advertising last year to make sure no one who buys our products ever thinks about mining. Right. And so the metal producers like it that way because they don't want to take on all of that baggage. And to the extent they can make sure the consumer never knows where the product came from, I think they're just as happy. That's probably unfair to some of them are probably better than that, but there are some of them out there who are not.
Well, and when I go back to thinking about Irma, one of the issues that we were confronting there, and Irma has had a long initial birthing process, and I guess it's now finally reached some point of congealing in the last 3 or 4 years, as I understand it. I'm not on top of it any longer, but the fact is that it's the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance is what the acronym stands for. What it was really struggling with was a multiple set of challenges that would be involved in the creation of such a standard, and I'm going to be interesting to see how they are going to manage as a multi-sector capacity the oversight and control and credibility over the long term of the standards. But one of the things that we were struggling with there was the reality that there's different mines within a single corporation that have different degrees of acceptability through the eyes of the consumer and the environmental movement and the indigenous community. One company may harbor within it some great successes and some very great failures at the same time, and somehow being able to recognize on a mine by mine basis as opposed to just a corporate basis was also an important part of kind of the taking people up the escalator without trying to solve every problem at the same time. That's kind of part of the whole dynamic that you had to deal with. So that was an example of something we were dealing with. The other area is traceability, as you were saying. I mean, somebody can say, my friend from Walmart can say, well, you know, I'm prepared to pay a premium for those minerals. But the reality is that once they've gone through the processing facilities, it's almost impossible to trace a mine and a particular product that reaches the consumer shelves. And so a lot of the kind of focus of people like today, and this is going forward now, and I think we should come back to it later, but the kind of work that Resolve has been doing is very much built upon trying to identify and trace and connect the dots between particular activities that are going on in particular location with particular consumer outlets or technology applications. And so that's a big part of what there is, because as Apple, I've heard them say in a room, we're not interested in knowing about every standard in the world. The fact that somebody's got a good housekeeping seal of approval is fine, but that doesn't deal with the fundamental risk we've got, because where the real risk lies is in a bad news story coming out of some aspect of the overall operation. So we're worried about the bad news stories. And standards are not about bad news stories. They don't protect you from bad news. And the public navigates themselves to an interest in the bad news stories, not, oh, what a good boy am I, through the standards. So that's another perspective.
Today's conversation has certainly given us a deep look into the challenges and opportunities around global standards in the mining industry. Glenn and Luke's experiences have shown us that while a lot of progress has been made, the road to creating enforceable, legitimate standards is still long and winding.
One of my key takeaways is the critical role that transparency and engagement play in this process. Standards can only be effective when they are inclusive, involving everyone from government and companies to local communities and NGOs. It's clear that building sustainable and responsible mining practices requires cooperation at every level. And Glenn and Luke predict that there will be a convergence of industry-led and multi-stakeholder governance models while emphasizing consumer pressure, traceability, and authentic engagement as keys to evolution of global mining standards.
So thanks again to Glenn Sigurdson and Luke Danielson for joining us today, and a huge thank you to our listeners for tuning in. We hope this episode has given you new insights into how the mining industry is evolving and the role we all play in driving responsible practices forward. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged in the conversations that matter. And note that our next episode tackles the pressing issue of social license to operate. What does it mean for a mining company to gain the trust of the communities where it works? We'll hear stories from around the world about how companies have navigated or failed to navigate this delicate balance. If you're interested in how trust and transparency shape the future of mining, you won't want to miss this episode. Join us next as we discuss the evolution of sustainability and resource management, reflecting on both the challenges and successes in adopting holistic approaches.